We put his head, don't we? Are we live now?
Yeah, we are live.
Okay. So, good afternoon and welcome to today's session. My name... Pardon?
Still not wanted. It's not wanted yet.
There's no one there yet. I thought you meant said we're...
Wait for a few more minutes.
Okay. You tell me when to go, yeah.
Two more minutes.
Okay, you tell me. That's fine. Thank you. Hi, Chris. So welcome to today's session. My name is Anna, and this introductory course is primarily aimed at finding ways to nurture serenity in these turbulent times that we're facing at present. So it'll include a meditation, a guided meditation towards the end, a talk, and if we have time, then an opportunity for questions, or they can be emailed in. The course will draw on the text by Venerable Geshe Acharya Thupten Lodin, who's a great Tibetan spiritual guide and teacher, on his book, The Meditations on the Path to Enlightenment. Geshe Lodin is from the same extraordinary peaceful lineage of teachers as His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other famous Tibetan Buddhist teachers who have come to the West. So Geshe Lodin lived in lived in Australia from 1976 until his passing at 88 in 2011, and he taught many thousands of students here in Australia and prior to then in India, and was much beloved. So I was very fortunate to be one of his students, and a few years before he passed away, I took ordination as a Buddhist nun. Trying as best I can to repay his decades of unfailing kindness and patience with us all, I continue to study here and volunteer with many others at this beautiful meditation centre here in Euroke, which includes this magnificent traditional Tibetan temple where I sit now. So today's topic. Many people are coping with this pandemic era really well. They're eating really good, nutritious food, enjoying the extra time to make great meals. They're doing exercise, they're staying connected with their family and friends, and being quite constructive with their time, mixing some leisure activities and some beneficial activities for themselves and others. But others are really finding the whole experience quite overwhelming and depressing, with 24/7 news and analysis, and so many events happening in their lives, such as the financial impacts of job loss, ill health themselves, difficulties that they hear about with their family and friends and need to support who are being unwell or passing, and great fear and anxiety of the virus itself, isolation and living in crowded conditions. Most of us are probably a little bit of a mix. We have our moments. So we're, can be coping really well, but then we have moments of fear and anxiety. So in this era of coronavirus, everyone really has their own story to tell. And so what can we do through these Buddhist teachings to bring the situation into perspective and to create the space for more happiness, and to reduce the impact of any of the more difficult moments, any underlying anxiety that we might be having, any stress, any emotional response to situations and to challenges. So the more that we can help ourselves to become more peaceful and calm and beneficial for ourselves and others, the better position we are for others as well. So this course over the next 5 weeks, except for Father's Day, we'll explore 5 areas that might provide some help. And the first one today, we're going to look at the deeper meaning of change, and 2020 has certainly been a very big example of that. Next week, we'll explore love and compassion and the real meaning of love and compassion as explained by the Buddha, and how that can really contribute to a happier life. In the third week, we'll look at some pathways to finding serenity. Within the Path to Enlightenment teachings, there is something that is known as the 6 perfections, and each of these offers really good advice to finding serenity. So we'll do a little summary of the 6 perfections. Then in the fourth week, we'll dive deep into meditations for a better life. Meditation within the Tibetan Buddhist context, there is obviously meditation taught in many different places, but in the Tibetan Buddhist context, it's quite an interesting and very powerful concept, because they teach calm abiding or stabilisation meditations such as the breath, but we also do a lot of study and analysis, and these are very profound teachings. And then I was listening to His Holiness explaining it during the week. So then what we do is, and it's very special, is we bring those 2 parts together, having a very stable mind, and then we bring that together with the analysis and study. And when we bring that together, the focusing on the results of our analysis, we can then actually stabilise on that thinking if we have accepted the logic of the analysis. And then that's very transformative for our mind. So it's a very special kind of meditation teaching. And I'll explain that more in the fourth week. And then in the fifth week, we'll look at some ideas for peaceful living, such as how to establish a regular practice, investigating the lives of some of the great teachers, and a few concepts like that might prove useful. So each one of these teachings is also a core teaching of a man who was initially called Prince Siddhartha, and he was later named Shakyamuni Buddha, and he's represented by the beautiful golden statue behind me, and he was the awakened one. So these teachings have passed down in an extraordinary pure lineage from teacher to student to teacher to student, teacher to student for almost 2,600 years, which is truly remarkable. And two of the recent great students in all of these decades and decades of years, who themselves became teachers, are His Holiness the Dalai Lama and our own spiritual guide, Geshe Loden. And it has been their job to make these profound teachings accessible to current generations beyond Tibet, and especially in the West. So Tibet was a very special place where there were lots of monasteries and many great teachers. And then after the early 1950s, there was an invasion of Tibet, and then later in the 1950s, 1959, both the Dalai Lama and Geshe Loden escaped into India. So that then led step by step to the beginning of teachings in a lot of Western countries by some of these very special High Lamas. And this is really quite a momentous time in history, and will be future recognised as such when we've had access to these amazing teachers at this time. So today's topic is the great value of learning about the real meaning of change. And when we really understand and embody the deeper meaning of change in our minds, events that unfold simply won't faze us as much. And we will learn that change, and so is taught by the Buddha, that change is a normal part of life. So whatever meets, then later parts, whatever rises, then falls, whatever is born will naturally later pass, and whatever joins together will then disperse. So just like the current pandemic, smallpox, the Spanish flu, SARS and Ebola, this time of coronavirus, or at least this very intense phase of coronavirus, will pass. Sooner rather than later would naturally be, I'm sure we would all be very happy about that, but we can't really control the timing. But what we can control is cultivating a more balanced and rational response to change such as pandemics. And this is an uncomplicated way for us to create more peace and happiness in our lives, and for ourselves and for those around us. So we begin to realise then our natural ability, we have a natural ability to function well even in the most difficult of circumstances. So if we continuously hold on to what we think, in contrast, if we continuously hold on to what we think is stable and solid and permanent, we're really living an untruth or a lie, because there really is only one certainty, that everything will change. And 2020 is a really perfect example of that. So this type of thinking of everything being solid, that all of us experience at some level, everything's in degrees, going from people who really, really hang on to things being solid and permanent to those people who in fact have a good understanding of change. So all of us experience this at some level. This can lead to us being really fearful and quite frightened and less able to function, or perhaps not function as well as we could. So last year, for example, the year before, and when we were young, Who would have thought in a million years that we would be living the way we are today across the world, with borders locked and many of us restricted in our own homes and only able to travel for the bare essentials, and so many people passing away sadly, their loved ones desperately unhappy, and doctors and nurses and our healthcare workers at frightening risk. Each of us can think about what we were doing this time a year ago and the year before that. There was probably some kind of pattern. But this pandemic has broken all of that. And we are all living so differently, impossible to imagine. And we don't know what is around the corner. So how good then is the wisdom of Shakyamuni Buddha around 2,600 years ago? He was initially living in quite amazing circumstances, a bit like many of us really, not quite the same, but we've been living in pretty amazing circumstances in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. Certainly there have been things happening in other parts of the world, but most of us, there's been, wars like the Vietnam War and the Iraqi War and the Afghani War, but most of us haven't had to experience it so directly. So the life that Shakyamuni Buddha lived so long ago was a very natural life. It was not so populated, the world, and it would have been very beautiful and so many trees and vegetation. And he was also a prince with all the luxuries of ancient India. He was very handsome, he was great at sport, his studies and all his endeavours, and many beautiful friends and a beautiful wife, a gorgeous wife. So he was living then at that time, his name was Prince Siddhartha, and he was living in his family's palace. And while he was at the edges of the palace, he experienced different forms of suffering. He experienced, for the first time, he saw a person who had passed away. Then he also saw somebody who'd been sick, and he saw a person who and what it was really about and what could be done about it, and why can't these people be like me? And he was a really profoundly considered person, and he decided that he really had to find some more answers to these questions, because he had such great compassion that he satisfied. I've also seen an ascetic. There were ascetics or monks in those days, and he thought, well, I think this is what I need to do. I need to go and live. I just don't have, the opportunity to think so much here. I just need to go and work on this and think about it more closely. So he decided to leave the palace and to go into the forest and to contemplate very deeply what all of this suffering was about, and to find out the answer to all his questions that had arisen. So one of the most important discoveries in his 6 years of meditation in the forest on the meaning of suffering was that everything produced is impermanent. And he thought to himself, he discovered that all beings and all products disintegrate. And he asked himself why. Why was this? First of all, he had that observation that everything is changing. There is nothing that is static. It is all changing. My body is changing. The plants around me are changing. Everything is changing. And he wanted to understand why. And he came to the conclusion that because people and products are the result of causes, conditions, and the collecting together of parts, and they don't have the power to sustain that product permanently. So Geshe Loden, who's just behind me, explains it really beautifully in his Path to Enlightenment books, and gives some really good examples of why this is such a relevant teaching and why it is really can be useful for us. So he says that a product is produced from the variety of parts, causal actions, and conditions. And we also give labels to all of those. For an example that we can explore in the West, we have decided to label our dwellings, the places that we live, we decided to call them houses. Therefore, a product comprises labels, parts, causal actions, and conditions. So let's then consider a house to get a good example. There's a lot of decisions being made about the house. And then the person who wants to build the house needs to find a builder, a plumber, a glazier, an electrician, and there are all sorts of endless numbers of manufacturers, tradespeople, and ancillary services that are going to help to put this house together. So therefore, we've got a house with its parts, its causes, its conditions, and its label. So that is a changeable object. So that house has come together with all of those aspects, and it's going to endure for a period of time. In fact, when the house is very first completed, the house will then begin to disintegrate almost immediately. So if you go and look at a new house after a couple of years, there's always fine cracks. That disintegration, so once it's together, the disintegration begins immediately. The paint might start to crack a tiny, tiny little bit. It'll be very fine at the beginning, but that disintegration has already begun. It endures for a period of time. This house, it'll last for a period of time, maybe 50 years, maybe 30 years. If better constructed, maybe 100 years. And if it's a big castle or something like that, maybe 200 years. But none of that house is going to be a permanent object. Eventually, it disintegrates into rubble. So any gathering together is impermanent and will eventually disperse. So we ourselves, we gather food and we gather clothing and we gather so many possessions, but none of the parts and causes and conditions. So we can check through our own logic to see whether the proposition that Shakyamuni put together 2,600 years and has been taught by teachers and after teacher for hundreds and hundreds of years, whether that holds up in our own minds. So we can check that ourselves and think about our various food and clothing and various possessions, whether they too have labels, whether they have parts, whether they have causes, and whether they have conditions. And in analysing that, then we can think about whether that proposition that was put forward by Shakyamuni Buddha was in fact correct. So we can look at a whole lot of other things, and we might mention a few more examples here. So plants might grow, for example, for days or years, but they decay and disappear eventually. So even beautiful giant trees like a Californian redwood tree that can grow very, very tall and live hundreds and hundreds of years, or a giant oak tree, also one day that tree will reach maturity and then begin the slow process of decay or disappearing. And that's the same with mountains and valleys, continents and oceans, suns, moons, planets, and even the universe, when it came into existence, changes constantly, and eventually that too will be no more. So then we can also observe our own body, and we can quite vividly see impermanence. So remember, we can remember back to when we ourselves were very, very young and strong, athletic or full of energy, and we loved to go on the swings and roundabouts and perhaps sit on our parents' laps. It was very, very great. And then we grew into teens and we didn't want to do those things anymore. And then through our 20s with so many changes and different experiences. And now we can even look in the mirror. We can even look in the mirror to see the impermanence. We can observe the changes of expression we might have. We can be looking quite relaxed, or we can be looking a bit tense, or we can have a big smile. So all of those changes of expression occur all the time. And sometimes if we look long enough, we can see tiny changes of impermanence before our eyes in the actual aging of our own bodies. So I believe that our skin actually changes every 7 years, and we are removing 30 to 40,000 skin cells every day. So it is quite conceivable that we can observe tiny changes in colour, shape and appearance that occur moment by moment. So thinking about our own biology, we can find many more examples of changes in our body that are happening all the time. But we tend to, as we walk around, think often we think that our bodies are quite solid, so we don't really think of our bodies as being a kind of a changeable thing. We think that we are very solid and that the people we mix with are very solid and that the houses are very solid, so we're not really focused on this continuous change. If we want to think about change and impermanence and check the truth of impermanence, we can also observe by discern the next. So our mind constantly changes because as a product, it is impermanent also. So mindfulness of the breath can also remind us of impermanence. If the breath were permanent, then its nature would be that it wouldn't change, and we wouldn't get the things that we need and being able to expel the things, the oxygen that we need, and expel the carbon dioxide that we don't need. So it also is completely impermanent. It would not rise or fall or move or change in any way. So even just in observing our breath, we can reflect on momentary changes and recognise the impermanence of our breath. In the about 800 years ago, there was 600 or 700 years ago, there was a great teacher known as a Tisha. And Tisha was one of the foremost people who brought some of the deeper Buddhist knowledge and teachings from India into Tibet. And he was known to sit by a river recollecting impermanence and to thinking really deeply about impermanence. So he would think about the flow of the water, and we'll do some meditation on the water and the currents, and he would watch the beautiful river and watch the flow of the water and how the currents were always moving and changing and the different aspects of the river. And in that way he would soften his mind to think more and more about impermanence and the importance of impermanence. And the same can be done with the ocean. When you look at the tides and the waves breaking on the rock, that can be an incredibly beautiful and interesting way of contemplating the impermanence of all things. So also in this group, we gather together online here to hear these teachings coming from so many different places, collecting together for the short time, an hour or so, maybe a little more, then refocusing our lives in different directions at the end of the session, so we can also reflect on the coming together and then the parting of groups. Even when we meet with our friends or meet with our family, it's a coming together and then parting again. We can also think about people's lives. So 150 years' time, it is absolutely certain, there is no question, that all the people that we're so familiar with in our daily news, people like President Trump, Jacinda Ardern, Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson, famous celebrities like Nicole Kidman and Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and every single one of them also will have passed. They seem like very stable and solid figures in our lives these days. They've been in our lives for some time, but they also in 150 years, none of us will be here and none of them will be here. So the essence of life really is impermanence. So as the Buddha said 800 years ago, collection ends in dispersal, rising ends in falling, meeting ends in parting, and birth ends in death. So then we'll just run through some reasons why impermanence, and I think I've touched on them earlier, why impermanence is so important to remember. So the first of those reasons is that because when challenges happen, we can remember that the pain and suffering from those challenges won't last. If they do last for some time, they will soften and lessen, just like our current lockdown and pandemic. So when we contemplate impermanence, it will lessen our fear. If we think that so many great events of history have also occurred in past. At the same time, if we become very familiar with impermanence and spend the time thinking about it, listening to it or reading about it, then thinking about it and then meditating, we also won't get so overexcited about the highs in our life because they won't last either. They'll be temporary. It's not to say that we don't enjoy the highs in our life and we don't rejoice in the highs in our life, but it's this overexcitement that might get us to think, oh, everything's solved now. Our life is fine now because this great thing has happened in our lives. Or everything is terrible because this terrible thing has happened in our lives. We become kind of fixated at that moment, and that creates a lot of anxiety and suffering. Either way it causes problems. Overexciting will lead us to losing our judgment, as will our anxiety. So we need to find the sort of middle place. So understanding impermanence will, will help us find a very peaceful place, like the deeper parts of the ocean. So in the deeper parts of the ocean, there might be a storm raging above. On the surface, all sorts of things could be happening on the surface of the ocean, but underneath in the deeper parts it remains strong and stable, yet permeable and flexible, able to move and act. So the other really important aspect of understanding impermanence is that it is the beginning of understanding a really important concept in Tibetan Buddhist studies called emptiness. And yeah, the emptiness, not emptiness as being nothing, it's the emptiness of inherent existence, which is a very, very powerful concept in Tibetan Buddhism. And it's, for example, one of the practices that we might do when we begin to understand emptiness, and I'll explain in a minute why it's such an important concept. So one of the practices we might do is to meditate on our body, and we might think about the impermanence of all of the aspects of our body and that they're not permanent. So that's why it's such an important part of understanding emptiness. And emptiness itself is really, really important because when we reflect on emptiness, when we eventually realise emptiness, then we have the ability to really deal with our negativities, our negative states of mind. So they teach, it is taught, the Buddha taught, that what we really need to do is to deal with our negativities at their roots. So it's like when you find a really difficult weed in the garden. If you are pulling out this weed, it's couch grass or something like that, and you're pulling out this couch grass, if you pull it out and you just leave the roots in there, then it's just going to regrow again. So emptiness is the great realisation and tool that is needed to really get out the roots of our couch grass, so to speak. And so that's why learning about impermanence is a really, really good foundation to then going on and learning about emptiness. And emptiness, we also see our interdependence and our interconnectedness and the true nature, view of the nature of reality, and which is also really essential for us to see and to remove our negative minds at their source. So there's lots and lots of great benefits of thinking about learning more about impermanence and thinking about it and meditating on impermanence. And so this is really where meditation and mindfulness and mind training come in, and they help us to reveal our natural potential for happiness and joy. So the Buddha taught that one of the other really wonderful things that he discovered in his years in the forest and in his awakening was that we all have what is known as natural potential or Buddha potential. That doesn't mean it's training and a lot of meditation and a lot of study to become a Buddha. It's a big job, but we do all have, all living beings, the Buddha said and found, have what is known as natural potential. So within us, we have the natural potential to become incredibly happy and joyous and be fantastic decision makers, have great concentration, have great clarity of mind, to be really happy, to be really connected, and all of the qualities, and have great love and compassion for other living beings, and to know what to do when a big drama occurs, and to know how to act decisively and well, and to be a really, really fantastic human being. So he said that it's kind of clouded up by all of our negative minds and our habits, and we have habits that we need to clear up and sort out. And so this is where this is what one of the other great things that Shakyamuni Buddha revealed after his great contemplations in the forest. And so meditating on impermanence is an important part of that journey. So just touching a little bit on meditation itself. So meditation has been taught by many different schools over many thousands of years, but now also modern science and lots of groups and organisations now teach meditation, but it's also been proved in science as being a really valuable thing to do and can create significant neural changes. So the Dalai Lama himself, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has made a very particular, and since he was very young, a great interest in studying science and making the connection for people who come from a more scientific background and who want to understand that it holds up, that something like meditation will hold up in the kind of Western focus, the strong Western focus on science. So a neuroscientist's name is Sarah Lazar, and she was at Massachusetts General Hospital and also working with Harvard Medical School. And she was one of the first scientists to take anecdotal claims about the benefits of meditation and mindfulness and test them in brain scans. And she was really surprised with the results of that, and that meditation can actually change your brain. So she explains, we found differences in brain volume after 8 weeks in 5 different regions of the brain in the 2 groups. So they had one that was meditating and one that wasn't meditating. And in the group that learned meditation, they found thickening in 4 regions. So I won't go through the technical names, but these are the things, the qualities that improve through regular meditation. So mind wandering and self-relevance, learning, cognition, memory, and emotional regulation. These all improved. And also perspective taking, getting a perspective, and empathy and compassion. So that's 3 different parts of the brain. And then there was also the fight or flight part of the brain, which is important for anxiety, fear, and stress in general. And the study found that the area of the brain that is important for anxiety, fear, and general stress became smaller in the group that went through the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. So they're very positive results for meditation and developing a regular meditation practice from a scientific perspective. Then there's been lots of other work happening. There's a a psychologist named Emma Seppala, and Emma is at Stanford University, and she's a scientific director of an organisation called CC Care. I think it's, I forget the exact name, but it's been set up at Stanford. It's been set up by Thupten Jinpa, who's a very famous Tibetan professor, and he was previously a high monk as well. And she says in her study that she found that she believes that meditation and mindfulness can even lengthen our lives, and that is also taught in the Buddhist teachings. So we're going to now do a meditation this week on impermanence. And I chose this because it can quickly bring about change in our minds and dealing with issues such as anxiety and fixations, and recognising that everything is bound to change. So if it is enjoyable, an event, that is great, but don't become too excited because it won't last. If the event that occurs in our life and the circumstances that arise in our life is really terrible, we aim not to get caught up in the negative emotions. It won't last. And so this meditation on impermanence will help us to spontaneously do that, to have a spontaneous understanding and appreciation of change, because that's how meditation works. We think about it, we listen to the subject, and then we think about it, and then we meditate it when we've come to a conclusion. So we're going to begin with some breathing meditation, so that by meditating on impermanence, our mind becomes like a giant ocean liner on the waves of a deep ocean. It's steady and stable. And if the calm, the ship stays steady. If the weather is rough, the giant ship stays steady. And we develop the capacity to remain calm and peaceful and in serenity, whatever is going on for us externally. So if we can now just pause for a minute. So let's begin by first establishing a good meditation posture. So a good meditation posture, you can be sitting cross-legged on the floor, or you can be sitting on a chair. Both of those are fine. If you don't enjoy sitting on the floor or can't. The most important aspect of a good meditation posture is to have a nice straight back. And then we want to have our shoulders nice and relaxed as well. So we can lift them up and drop them down. To do that, we're likely to become sleepy. So just middle way, looking down the bridge of our nose. And the best place to put our tongue, we have our mouth closed, and we put our tongue on the roof of the mouth to prevent the build-up of saliva. So our eyes can either be fully closed, or if you're able to, just slightly open to let in a little bit of light. So then we're going to choose a place where we would like to observe the breath. So some people are more comfortable watching the breath going up and down the nostrils. And some people prefer the rising and falling of the diaphragm. And some people even prefer the rising and falling of the upper chest. So that's completely up to you, whichever you feel the most comfortable doing. So for this exercise, we're going to just watch the movement of our breath in our chosen spot and reflect on the impermanence of the breath as the air comes in and the air goes out take in our oxygen and get rid of our carbon dioxide, and the tiny movements and subtle changes that continuously occur as part of that. We become distracted by thoughts about other things. Just gently let those go and just bring our mind back to observing the breath, just for this short time. Then if it happens again, then we do that again. Very gentle, bringing our mind back to the focus of this session, observing the rising and falling or movement of the breath. The breath moves up and down or in and out. We observe these tiny, subtle changes. No need to get concerned if we lose concentration. We just gently bring our mind back. Then we can focus our attention thinking about our body and observing or recollecting the impermanence of our body. Remember, as children, how we might have loved to go on the swings or play footy in the backyard, maybe sit on our parents' laps while we watch television. Not so long ago. And that time passed. And in our teens, it was a whole different experience of the world. And we were so curious and had the vitality of our youth. and reflect on those. And then we remember that each day we are removing thousands of skin cells. Maybe over time our hair has changed colour. We get to notice the tiny changes in colour, shape and appearance that occur moment by moment. You can think about and observe the impermanence of the tiny changes in the mind. Our moods change throughout the day. One moment elated, despairing the next, perhaps depending on the news of the day, what's happening, have the numbers gone up or the numbers gone down, what's happening to our families, what's happening in different countries. Perhaps worrying, be calm in the morning and agitated by the afternoon. Or vice versa. Full of altruism and kindness one moment, and completely obsessed with self-concern the next. The mind continuously changes because it is a product, and as a product it is impermanent. And we think about the river, like the great master Atisha, who sat by the river recollecting impermanence. We think about the flow of the water. We imagine currents always moving and changing. Throughout its great passage, the river is continuously changing. Times it meanders very placidly. At other times it's a busy torrent falling over rocks. Sometimes broad, sometimes narrow, sometimes very deep, sometimes very shallow, sometimes very straight. And at other times it's twisting and winding. We can use this river as an analogy for our minds, like the one stream of consciousness is never the same in the present instant as it was in the instant before. Like the river, our mind is sometimes open, sometimes closed or enclosed. Sometimes it's very deep. And sometimes very narrow. Sometimes our mind is as straight as an arrow, clear, beautiful. And sometimes winding and confused. So for a short time we reflect and meditate on the impermanence of the mind. The essence of life is impermanence. As the Buddha said so clearly, collection ends in dispersal. Rising ends in falling. Meeting ends in parting. And birth ends in death. Everything in our lives, every product, every event is impermanent. So we can come to two important conclusions. We might be experiencing a difficult period during this coronavirus as a group, as a world, but this time will pass as well. And our best way to manage the highs and lows is to remain steady and calm as possible. It is our mind or mental state that is the boss, not the external experience. So in recognition, close the meditation with a dedication. So in recognition of the effort of this meditation and this class, we can dedicate any positive energy that we have created towards more happiness in our life, more good conditions, better health, and also more happiness and good conditions for the people we love, and if we like, for all living beings. So if you like to relax and so next week we'll look at the value of great love and compassion. And if you have some time in the meantime during the next week and you would like, recommend some meditation on impermanence. There's lots of examples that we covered today. So I believe this session you could either use this as a guided meditation, so you can be guided, or you can develop your own meditation practice on impermanence, and in that way then our minds will become more like the steady ship or the deep ocean, nice and stable, regardless of what is going on around us. Okay, so we have got a little bit of time over. Went through that a little bit more quickly than I expected, so I'm sorry if I spoke too fast. But if anyone has a question, you're very welcome to put it up and I can see it on the live chat. Wait a minute or two for the buffering. You can see there's been some buffering. Okay, so if there's no questions, just give it another minute or two, but I'd like to just wish you all a good week ahead, an enjoyable week ahead, and look forward to seeing you next week if you'd like to join us to explore the great benefits of great love and great compassion. Thanks, Jill, for your comments. It is lovely to be in the temple. And I look forward to the time when everyone can be back together in the temple. It'll be marvellous.
Chris has a question.
All right. Both of these minds, I believe both of these are impermanent. I will double check that, Chris, and come back to you on that one. So I'll take the question about the primordial mind on notice, and I will have a response to that next week. Thanks, Chris, for the question. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great week. Thank you.